the Cybertruck stands out because it is huge, especially to the European eye, because in Europe we are seeing cars getting bigger, we see a lot of SUVs, but not those huge ones, which means that the Cybertruck does come across as something quite alien in every way.
Car spreading. What is it and why is it a problem? Across the world, cars, including electric vehicles, are getting taller, wider and bigger. And as well as making it harder to park, car size is having an impact on climate change. And it's not a small impact. One report estimates that if SUVs, the biggest type of cars, were a country, they'd be the world's 5th largest emitter of carbon dioxide. I'm Jordan Dunbar, and this week on The Climate Question from the BBC World Service, we're looking at why cars are getting bigger and what can be done. With me to talk about this is Theo Leggett, who's the BBC's international business correspondent. And you've been looking into this, haven't you, Theo?
I've been looking into the phenomenon of car spreading, and it is fascinating, Jordan.
Well, thank you for joining us. And then from Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, we have Anjani Trivedi, who is The Economist magazine's global business correspondent and something of an expert on electric vehicles and batteries. Hello, Anjani.
Hi, Jordan.
So, I just want to ask, Anjani, you're in Dubai. It's known as a big car city. Lots of people drive there. I'm imagining on the highways, you've got lots of small, fuel-efficient, non-showy cars. Is that what you see in your commute to work every morning?
You'll be surprised. You see just about everything. You do see those small, efficient cars, but you also see Ford pickup trucks. You see the Lamborghinis, but you also see a lot of Chinese SUVs. You see lots of Chinese-made electric vehicles and many Teslas and hybrids as well. But if there was one place where you see large cars, Dubai and Abu Dhabi would be it.
Well, we're going to get into what the rest of the world is driving a little later on. Theo, before we get in your job, what's the biggest car you've seen, driven or sat in?
Well, the one that's impressed me most in terms of size, and not necessarily in a good way, is the Tesla Cybertruck. Because if you go around one of the European car shows, for example, you'll see lots of cars, many of them pretty big. We're going to be talking about the prevalence of SUVs. But even so, the Cybertruck stands out because it is huge, especially to the European eye. Because in Europe, while cars are getting bigger, we don't have as many of the kind of pickup trucks that Anjani was talking about there that are very popular in the United States and in some other markets. We are seeing cars getting bigger. We see a lot of SUVs, but not those huge ones, which means that the Cybertruck does come across as something quite alien in every way.
Okay, well, I really want to get into this phenomenon that people are calling autobesity or car spreading. Theo, you've done a report on this. First of all, how much bigger have all types of cars gotten?
They've been getting steadily bigger over the past few decades. So just to give you an idea, the Volkswagen Golf, a car that everybody's familiar with pretty much, it's in its 8th generation now. The current model you'll find is 18 centimetres wider and 26 centimetres longer than the original version from the 1970s. That might not sound like a lot, but if you see them up side by side, it really is noticeable. But it's not just that individual car models are getting bigger. It's that the kind of cars that people are buying are getting bigger as well. And that's particularly true of sports utility vehicles, which are the kind of cars which are at least loosely based on 4x4 off-roaders. And if you go back to 2011, in Europe, they made up just 13% of the market. They now make up 60% of the market.
Wow.
So just cars themselves are expanding, but people are also choosing to buy bigger models as well.
It's the SUVs that are the biggest cars in the market.
Yes, and the SUVs are the ongoing trend for various reasons, which we can go into. They have been getting much more popular over the past decade and a half, and that's having a real impact because the more big cars you have on your roads, particularly in a country like the UK where we've got lots of narrow rural lanes, if you have lots of these things, there's less space for everything else.
So why are these SUVs, some people call them 4x4s, but they don't often have four-wheel drive, why are they becoming so popular?
I think one of the big points is people feel safer in them.
Okay.
When you sit in an SUV, you're higher up, you're above the level of the road, you can see further, and you're also surrounded by more space. And I think that has a psychological impact that people simply feel safer. Of course, the downside to that is an SUV is a big car, it's also heavy, it has a high bonnet, and that means that it may well be safer for the occupants, but it's not necessarily safer for other road users. And it's not just that, it's also status as well. People want to be in large, gleaming cars. The car has been, since its earliest origins, a status symbol, and that still applies. So if somebody sees that their next door neighbour has got a big, flashy SUV on the drive, there may be a bit of FOMO, a bit of fear of missing out. They may want one too, and that'll inspire them to go and buy one. And then, of course, because you have these big cars on the roads and there are fears of what will happen in collisions, you also get safety standards on cars being built up. That means that modern drivers expect their cars to have lots of airbags, for example. They expect them to have a high, if they're in Europe, a high Euro NCAP safety rating. And that means that more equipment has to be put in these cars, which makes them bigger because more equipment needs space, and it also makes them heavier.
There's a stat that nearly half of new cars sold in 2024 were SUVs, and that was globally. So this is massive. They're popular with people who want to buy them, but are manufacturers keen to make them?
Yes, they are, because manufacturers can make bigger profits out of SUVs. And the reason for that's pretty simple. If you're going to make cars, there are certain things you need. You need a factory. You need employees. You need production lines. You need to be building engines. You need to be building gearboxes. And the costs of that are pretty much the same whether you're building big cars or small cars. But if you're building big cars, luxury models, you can put a higher price tag on them. So therefore, the profit margins are bigger and companies will make more money. Which is why, incidentally, Ford stopped making the Fiesta. Fiesta, you could call it an iconic car. It had been around for decades. It was a favourite of drivers.
One of the best-selling cars in Europe, right?
Yes, exactly, for year after year. But Ford decided to stop making it because it couldn't make enough money. It could make bigger profits out of bigger cars. The advantage there being you don't have to make as many.
Anjani, I want to come to you and zoom out a little bit and go globally, because Asia Pacific is the biggest region for SUVs. India in particular has seen huge growth. And I'm wondering why in that region are people buying these big cars? We mentioned highways in Dubai, but are some of these people in rural areas? Are they farmers, or are they doing it for the comfort, the image, and the aspiration?
So I'll say it's a bit of both. But one thing, whether you're in India and you're on the rough roads of India, a lot of local manufacturers are also now making SUVs. Like Mahindra has made the Thar for many, many years, and newer versions of that, so that you feel that you can drive a good-looking SUV. You have the cushion on when you're driving through over the big potholes, and it's an affordable car. And on top of that, there's a status symbol there's a status symbol associated with driving a bigger car in these emerging markets. And there is a safety issue, right? People don't care that air quality in New Delhi is terrible. People will still buy these cars if they can afford it, if they can feel safe in it, if it is kitted out with, biohazard, ventilation systems and all sorts of other things. And that becomes a driver of picking up these cars. People no longer, it's aspirational as well. And that element is very important in places like India and Indonesia and elsewhere. The other point, which is true of perhaps the West as well, is that, when people think about the value proposition of a large car, is that if you have that extra third row, there is that much more space. And so for mothers that are carpooling and taking kids to soccer, it's good to have, 3 or 4, be able to have 4 or 5 extra seats where you can have kids in the seatbelt because they can't have a child in the front seat. There's a lot of the soccer mom and the classic van has been around for a long time. And so having a nicer looking version of that, is aspirational. So I think there's a multitude of factors that are playing into this.
I wanted to speak to you about that aspiration. My social feeds are full of footballers, politicians, celebrities, musicians, and they're not in sports cars anymore. They're in luxury SUVs. And in Dubai, you know, a city famous for its supercars, are you seeing these Lamborghini SUVs, these Porsche SUVs? Is that playing into it as well?
Oh, for sure. You know, you see Bentley SUVs and all over the place. You will see cyber trucks, and you will see just about everything. So there is definitely an aspirational element from kind of a supercar to a super luxury SUV. But I also think there's people, because these are heads. These are people who think these are genuinely good cars and want to drive them if they can afford them. So there's a lot of that because there's no shortage of wealth.
One thing I would mention is we're talking about brands like Lamborghini and Porsche, obviously brands that are best known for sports cars.
Yeah,
but,
fast racing cars.
Porsche's sales of the Cayenne, the Macan, their SUVs, quite big. For Lamborghini, their best-selling car is the Urus, which is obviously an SUV as well.
Footballer special, lots of
making
Premiership
an
footballers have
SUV.
it.
So even brands which have made their names touting the ideal of the sports car, they're now focusing on SUVs because that's where they make the money. That's where the demand is.
So they're popular with consumers around the world. They're aspirational. They're popular with manufacturers because they make more profit. They're getting bigger, which means they're getting heavier. Theo, when you were looking at this, did carbon emissions come up? Did the climate change angle come up?
Absolutely, because a lot of effort has been put in by policymakers over the past few decades to reduce the emissions from road transport. And technology has improved hand over fist over the past few decades. You know, I drive an MGB classic car in my spare time.
That's a small car.
It's a small car. It's very small compared to modern cars. It wasn't big in its day, and now it feels tiny to drive. But you drive that on the road, you can smell the fuel coming out, you can see the smoke because it's an old car. Nowadays, cars are so much more efficient, but a lot of the benefits of that improved efficiency have been lost because cars are bigger and heavier. And if your car is bigger and heavier, it requires more fuel. So even though the technology is better, the efficiency is greater, fuel consumption overall hasn't declined as much as you would expect because the technology is being used to carry more weight.
So in 2024, the International Energy Agency, which is the global energy authority, they did a report into emissions and they actually looked into SUVs. And in their report, they said if SUVs were a country, they would be the world's 5th largest emitter of carbon dioxide. So that's not all cars, that's just SUVs as a model, which is pretty incredible. And the fact that we're saying they're getting more popular makes it seem like it could be more of a climate problem. And remember, carbon dioxide is the main greenhouse gas that scientists say is driving climate change. SUVs emit roughly 20% more CO2 per kilometre than mid-sized cars on average. One solution to that is electrification. Anjani, you're across the global electric vehicle industry. Talk to me about where we are with sales. Where are electric vehicles doing well? You know, how common have they become around the world?
So let me start from where I am right now, which is in Dubai, where electric vehicle sales are growing. And what's more is, in a city where you see all these SUVs and big cars, as we were just discussing, and gas guzzlers, you also see today, in fact, I was looking at stats around secondhand sales of electric vehicles are rising very sharply. So there is a lot of demand for electric vehicles because ultimately you're driving long distances. There is very good infrastructure here in terms of charging facilities in mall parking lots and elsewhere. It's very easy to get chargers installed. For example, there's a fleet of Tesla taxis, and they have common, the road authority has set up these charging areas where taxis can go charge up. And so in a place like that, they had set up the infrastructure and the ecosystem in a way where EVs, regardless of the long distances and so on that you have to drive, EVs are doing very well. Now, then you go to India, where the stock of EVs is still relatively low. However, it's growing very fast. I was in India last month, and what you see a lot of is 2- and 3-wheeler electric vehicles, because that's where the delivery riders, the tuk-tuks, and kind of all of those are also getting electrified, and they are being made in India as well. So the cost of those is also low, and people are being incentivized to drive them, so they're doing well. And China, of course, as we know, I think 1 in 3 of the cars that are sold are electric.
Those electric vehicles, the passenger cars, lots of those people are buying are SUVs. They're electric SUVs, right?
There is a mix. So you are starting to see electric SUVs. Ultimately, there's not that many electric SUVs in the market yet. There's Rivian and so on, but those come at a very high price point. But you are starting to see there are a lot of plug-in hybrids, which kind of leaves you in the middle of. So you'll see Volvo has the XC90 and which is a hybrid, and Mercedes has a plug-in hybrid. And so you're starting to see that in between, which is doing very well. Right now, electric SUVs are relatively more expensive. And I think when you get to a point where there are more of them, there's more choice, and there's more availability, and they meet that sweet spot of affordability, then yes, there is a case for people to say, why not have a fuel efficient or clean car that also fulfills my needs of wanting a bigger car, for whether it's safety or the various other considerations we discussed earlier.
As SUVs become more popular and as electric vehicles, what is the problem if they're not polluting out of the exhaust of having bigger, heavier electric vehicles from an environmental standpoint?
Ultimately, when we think about the manufacturing of these cars, I think Theo kind of made this point earlier, but if you're manufacturing, you're using more materials, and if you think back all the way upstream to the supply chain, and you think all the materials that will need to be dug out for the catalytic converter to the body, to the wiring, to everything, you will need more materials, more mining. And regardless, automobiles they have internal combustion engines or hybrids or batteries, all require from mine to car have, yes, a pretty large carbon footprint. However, that relative to the exhaust, the emissions from exhaust is still a bit lower. And I think the second thing is around batteries and what that means from what chemicals and fumes and emissions that come out from just the manufacturing process.
I mean, SUVs are clearly popular with consumers, as we see, because they keep buying them. But with governments who have pledged to reduce carbon emissions, cities that are trying to reduce traffic, pedestrian deaths, etc., are we seeing a backlash to these bigger cars?
It's a really interesting question, because when I was writing the article that you referred to about car spreading, I found there were plenty of people who are willing to condemn the trend towards having bigger cars, but also an awful lot of people who are driving bigger cars, and the sales figures alone tell you that they're popular. So it does seem to me, and this is purely my personal opinion, that people don't like big cars when they're driven by other people. So the idea that the market will restrain itself, maybe not. But there are indications that governments are starting to clamp down on at least the very biggest cars, and authorities doing it. And the classic example of that is Paris, which last year controversially tripled parking charges for the heaviest vehicles. So they went up from €6 an hour to €18 an hour, or for €75 for 6 hours to €225. So that was a big increase. And what they say happened was that within a few months, the number of cars parking on the street in Paris had gone down quite drastically. That doesn't mean people aren't parking off street, of course, but it does suggest that there's been an impact. And Paris is one of those cities that really needs to do something, because I don't know if you've spent much time there, but the city is notorious for its dreadful traffic. And the French government is also doing similar things. It's increased registration charges on the biggest cars. And I think that's something that may be taken up by other administrations, local and national, around the world, where perhaps the very heaviest cars will be targeted, where we're talking sort of 2.5 tons. Maybe less so the sort of middle range crossover cars, the more middle market family ones. I don't think we'll see a big clampdown on those anytime soon. But the very biggest ones, I think there is a move now towards taking some kind of action against them.
A real tension, though, because, as you said, people may in these polls disagree with them, but people keep buying them. They clearly love them for all the reasons that we've spelt out. Anjani, can cities and governments design incentives to favour smaller, lighter EVs if they want to, for whether it be climate, traffic or road damage reasons? Are there things they can do to encourage the electric vehicles on sale that are smaller and lighter?
I think there is a potential for that. And just as we saw with the way policy was used to drive electric vehicle adoption in China, there is a way to perhaps incentivize this kind of congestion charge type, using mechanisms like that to incentivize people to drive smaller cars. Just as on the highway, there are certain lanes for heavy vehicles, and you cannot go in certain lanes in some countries if you're driving an SUV, or they separate, they'll separate traffic based on the size of the vehicle, which happens in certain countries. There is a way to do that.
Theo?
One of the things I think that we have to talk about is not just the stick, it's the carrot as well. And that means the availability of affordable small electric cars, because price is a key differentiator here. If you look at the European market, the first really usable electric cars that came on the market tended to be SUVs, or at least larger cars, because as we discussed before, larger cars come with higher profit margins. So if companies were going to invest in electric cars and electric cars were expensive to build, they wanted a return on that. So they were bringing out expensive electric cars. If you wanted a small, cheap electric car, there simply wasn't one to buy. That's now changing. And it's changing in part because Chinese manufacturers are increasingly moving onto markets outside China, and a manufacturer like BYD, for example, is not looking at the high end of the market necessarily. It's also looking at the lower end of the market. So it's brought out a car called the BYD Dolphin Surf. That's what it's called in Europe. It's the BYD Seagull in its home market. And this is a very small electric car. It's an affordable electric car. And that I see as kind of a replacement for the Ford Fiesta, which obviously, Ford isn't building anymore. It means that there is an affordable electric car on the market. And other manufacturers are coming forward with similar things as well. So if you have small, affordable electric cars, it's possible you may find people buying them, and more people moving to electric cars who have been unable to do so in the past. So it's not just about governments or local authorities putting up obstacles to big cars. It's also about having a real and practical alternative. And then you might find that, yes, some people will stick to SUVs because they've got the large families, because they're driving on motorways and they want to feel safe. But you will also have the city drivers, the local drivers, the people who want a neat little runaround. And historically, neat little runarounds have been pretty popular. So perhaps we could see a change in fashion as well, where no longer people are thinking, my neighbour's got an SUV, I want one. They'll perhaps be looking at a Renault 5 or an ID Polo and thinking, that's kind of cute. I like that. So we could see some kind of social change because the availability of electric models is widening, and there will be something there for everybody's taste.
So tastes could change, fashion could change. Anjani, what do you think in the future? Will we be here discussing SUVs the size of a house, or do you think it could completely change again?
I think it could completely change. I think at some point, a big car just becomes inconvenient and bulky. And, to everything we were talking about earlier, whether it's parking these cars, whether you're in a city like Hong Kong, where it's very difficult to drive an SUV on the narrow, windy roads, those aren't changing. And so I think we reach a happy medium where people will drive when there are options. People will choose from those options. I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago that we were talking about electric SUVs and gas guzzlers and bigger cars, but also electric cars. And so I think we can't underestimate consumer taste.
Well, I look forward to having you both back in a decade to see where we are. Anjani in Dubai, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Theo, thank you very much for coming and speaking to us.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel so you don't miss out. And if you have a climate question of your own, then write it in the comments below and we'll answer it in a future show. I'm Jordan Dunbar, and I'll see you next time.